Today we begin a new topic, the topic of populations. And so I thought we should start that topic by looking at a population. We're looking here at a herd of North American bison. Notice that when we use the term population, it means something other than the term community. Populations occur within communities, and so we're focusing in from a broader perspective to a narrower one. We're now looking at what goes on within individual species, and we're looking at the number of individuals within those species. We'll also be talking about how it is that those populations are distributed in space and over time. So let's begin. Let's start with some definitions. First of all, we can define a population as the number of individuals of a species that inhabit a particular area. And we can talk about the science of population biology as the study of those populations. We're interested in that study in particular in reasons for population change over time, as well as reasons behind changing distributions of populations. One other term that we should start out by defining is the term population structure. And that refers specifically to how densely packed are individuals. So how many individuals per acre might you have? And also, within that population, how are they dispersed? Are they dispersed uniformly, or is their distribution within their range something other than uniform? Let's start out by looking at a population at a local scale. These trees here are all red maples. And notice that you have several clusters of them, and then you have spaces in between where there are no red maples. So that's an example of a spacing pattern of individuals. If we wanted to talk about the range of red maples, then that would be quite a different story. Red maple actually is one of North America's most widespread species, occurring from quite far to the north all the way to the southern tip of Florida. So we can find them growing in association with spruces at one end of their range and with palm trees at the other end. So let's turn our attention from local distributions and local spacing patterns to large-scale geographic patterns. We're looking here at a map of the distribution and population densities of the downy woodpecker, one of the most widespread species of woodpeckers in North America. This is its summer distribution. Notice that there are darker areas across the mid-continent. Darker areas would correspond to highest population densities. And then as we travel to the west, population densities start dropping until in the desert southwest they are largely absent. Compare this to their winter distribution. We still have in wintertime a concentration of individuals across mid-continent, but the distribution does change subtly. Some of the populations that were denser in summertime in New England are now lower. And so with a species like a bird, which can get up and move pretty readily, its distributional pattern does change from summer to winter. And this is even true for a species like the downy woodpecker, which is largely sedentary. They are not known to travel all that much from summer to winter. Some species that are highly migratory, of course, it will be very different. So again, here's what I'm getting at. There's a couple phenomena we have been looking at here. One is spacing, how it is that individuals are distributed across a landscape. And we could talk about local spacing, like with our red maples in that photograph before. Or we could also talk about spacing at a larger scale. We could talk about how densely packed individuals are within their entire geographic range, like we saw with the downy woodpecker. It was not uniformly distributed throughout its entire range. And then we can also talk about the geographic distribution of a species as a whole. Where is it found and where is it not found? This is often a very interesting question to ask because one can then get out issues like what controls geographic distribution? What is the cause of the northern range limit of the downy woodpecker? What is the cause of its low density in the southwest? Questions like that, often which, by the way, are rather difficult questions to answer. But we'll be investigating some of those kinds of issues as we work our way through this topic. A related issue to that geographic distribution one, and for that matter the spacing one, is the issue of population dynamics. How is it that populations change over time? And how do those dynamics influence things like spacing and geographic distribution? Let's focus a little bit further on this issue of spacing. We're looking here at aquatic plants growing at the edge of a pond. And if you notice in this image here, they're not uniformly distributed. You have some species, notice those water lilies with the white flowers, occupying a portion of the image, and then there's open water above them and to the left of them. But on the left there's a different species, pickerel weed, which is coming right up out of the water and clusters about in the lower left part of the image. So for both of these species, they have a certain kind of a distribution within this local area. And so we might consider what kinds of distributions are these. So let's define what the possible patterns are. There are three general patterns. The water lilies and pickerel weeds are illustrating a clumped distribution where you have clusters of individuals of a species in some spots and fewer or none in other spots. An alternative would be random distribution, where there is no apparent spacing pattern. And one last pattern that we find, particularly in desert plants, is a spaced pattern where individuals are regularly spaced across the landscape and have a distance from other members of the same species that is approximately equal, therefore. If we look at this desert photograph here, for example, those trees are Joshua trees, a tree that occurs in southwestern North American deserts. And if you look, especially in the background, the trees are about evenly spaced apart. They're not perfectly evenly spaced apart because this is real live nature and not a laboratory. So we do have interfering variables playing a role here. But by and large, what you're looking at is more or less of a spaced pattern. Now in the foreground, looking at the sagebrush, if we were to look directly down on that, there would be a certain amount of even spacing there as well. You have to keep in mind that all these trees and all these shrubs are competing over a very limited water resource. And so they do tend to spread out. However, as we're looking at this view here, the pattern does not appear to be terribly well spaced. It looks to be more of a random pattern. Now let's turn our attention back from spacing to distributions. And we'll use the black-capped chickadee as an example here. Black-capped chickadee is a widespread species in North America, occurring from Alaska all the way across the continent to eastern parts of North America and south to about the center of the continent, where it's replaced by another species. Almost from 1 mile to the next, we go from this species, the black-capped chickadee, to the other species, the Carolina chickadee. And that's another story that we can talk about. But let's consider its distribution in the state of Connecticut. So what factors control distributions? There are several we can think of. One would be physiology, the internal workings of plants and animals. Every species of plant or animal is going to have certain limits to its physiological tolerance. How much cold can it stand? How much wet can it stand, or dry can it stand? In the case of the chickadee has a broad range of tolerance, being able to occur all the way up in very cold northern latitudes, and yet still be rather at home in mild climates. Although we don't find it when we get into the subtropics of the deep south. And so physiological factors could be among those playing a role for its absence from those regions. Another issue would be ecological tolerances. And that's what I was getting at with the issue of its very close relative, the Carolina chickadee. Although it would appear, for example, that the climate of southern and northern New Jersey are not terribly different. It is the black-capped chickadee that occurs in northern New Jersey, and it is the Carolina chickadee that occurs in southern New Jersey. That would seem to occur that there is some ecological issue here, perhaps competition between these two species, although there is still quite a bit of debate about that among the scientific community, exactly why it is that they have such a distinct boundary between their two ranges. Another factor would be the dispersal ability of species. Now, in the case of birds, of course, birds are very good dispersers for the most part. They can get up and fly. But other species, like salamanders, turtles, things like that, like this red-spotted newt here with those tiny little eggs, this is a species that is not nearly as good of a disperser as a bird is. And so indeed they can get up and move from one place to the other, but it takes them a long time to change their geographic distribution on those toothpick legs of theirs. Still another issue is population pressure. So as populations grow in one region, it can be the engine that drives range expansion of a species, or alternatively, if a species is doing poorly in the heart of its range so that it's not producing enough young to support its populations, then what we might see is a range contraction over time. So let's focus in on these two maps. These are maps of eastern Connecticut. The one on the left is a map which has superimposed over it the population densities of black-capped chickadees in the summertime. The map on the right is the same region and with the population densities of chickadees superimposed for the winter. So notice that in summertime, most of the population of chickadees in eastern Connecticut tends to be in the northern part of the state. You have lower densities in the southeastern part of the state. And now compare that to what you see in the winter. In the winter, the northern half of the region largely empties out of chickadees, and instead you have high population densities in the southern part. down towards the coast of Connecticut. So we might ask ourselves, what is that related to? What factor is controlling this change in distribution? Now, chickadees, being a permanent resident, are going to be influenced by this change in climate that happens from summer to winter. And if we compare the average temperatures at the various study sites that were used to produce these maps, what we discover is that there's quite a close relationship between average winter temperature and where you find birds. So let's consider what this graph shows us. This is a graph of average winter temperature measured in kelvins versus the location of these various study sites, with location being measured by the latitude at which the site occurs, but also by its elevation. And if we then graph location versus Kelvin, what we discover, without going into all the details, is that as we get toward the coast to the lowest elevation sites, temperature averages higher, and as we go inland to the highest elevation sites, we have the coldest average temperatures. So now that we've established this relationship between average winter temperature and location of study sites, we can ask the question, how does location and hence temperature relate to population densities of species like chickadees? And that's what this graph tells us about. And again, without getting into all the details of what the numbers on the axes mean, what it shows us is that as we approach locations on the coast, population densities go up. And as we go inland to higher elevation locations, population densities go down. Now we can ask another question, which would be a good question to ask, and that is, how can we be sure that the effect we're seeing isn't due to location rather than temperature? And that's a question that I actually had to take a hard look at. And the answer is that there's not enough elevation in this region of eastern Connecticut to adequately explain the kinds of changes in population density. The only really strong relationship that exists is between temperature and density. So kind of by process of elimination, it looks like temperature is the key variable. So we can suppose that regions with milder climates, such as you would find in the southern half of that study area, are being differentially sought out by chickadees. And this would appear to be a physiological reason. So in the wintertime, when food is scarce and energy is at a premium, if you live in milder climates, you don't need to burn so many calories to get through a day. And so it's not surprising when you look at it that way that most birds would tend to wind up in more southern regions where the average temperature is greater. Now let's change our focus still again. We're looking here at an overwintering group of ducks off the coast of Rhode Island. This is a mixed species flock. We have these real black birds with the orange beaks are common scoters. And then if you look very carefully, you might be able to see ones with little white stripes on their wings. Those are white-winged scoters. And then the ducks with the big white patches on them are male common eiders. There's actually also some females, but they're harder to identify because they're kind of dark brown. But if you look at the shape of their head, you can see that eiders have a particular kind of a sloping profile. And if you look for birds like that that are all brown, those are the females. But anyway, identification is not really my point here. My point is to focus in on dispersal ability. And as I've said, and as should be quite obvious, birds are quite good at dispersing. All three of these species nest in the far north and come to places like Rhode Island only for the winter, where they live just offshore and feed on the resources which are available in the open ocean. So birds are good at that. At least most kinds of birds are good at that, but other kinds of animals are less good at that. If you have to walk instead of fly, it costs a lot more calories to get around, so you're not likely to be as good of a disperser. But again, it depends on your size. Something like a wolf, which walks, is very good at dispersing. In fact, wolves are slowly repopulating much of the continent. But then there are other animals that are still less good at doing that. And depending upon dispersal ability, that's going to influence, as we've been talking about, distributions. Now, ecologists have looked at this issue of dispersal a great deal. And in association with this phenomenon of dispersal, they've developed several models that explain the distribution of species based on dispersal phenomena. And so we're going to talk about 4 of these. The models are the metapopulation model, the source sink model, the ideal free distribution model, and the landscape model. All these are rather related to each other, and to a significant degree some are subsets of others. So we will start today by investigating the metapopulation model, and then next time we will consider some of these other models and complete this topic. So let's start out this discussion by looking at an image. Notice in this image that we have several patches of forest, but that each patch of forest is isolated from every other patch by some other kind of habitat. In this case, what the other habitat is marshland. So that pale green sort of place, grading into brown even in spots, those are marshes. And then the darker blue-green, and you can even see trees in the image, those are forested areas. And just like the forests are isolated into patches, so is the marsh. Notice that the marsh is broken up into a couple pieces by a river and creeks going into the river. And so we have isolated patches of marsh as well. And so we therefore have plant species that are isolated into separate patches. And we have to presume that animals live in these forests and marshes too. So the animal species that live in them are also divided up into these isolated populations. This kind of phenomenon is referred to as the metapopulation phenomenon. By metapopulations, that's what we mean, are these isolated patches of habitat that contain isolated populations of species. Well, let's consider this idea in an area that's been more thoroughly analyzed. So what we're looking at here is an aerial infrared image superimposed over a topographic map. And you notice that there's all these different colors on this. What we have here is a wetland again, and within that wetland the individual plant communities on it have been defined with different colors. The black areas, by the way, are water. So if we look at this wetland, we see these red areas that correspond to one plant community, In fact, that plant community is one of reeds, the common reed. And we have deep green areas, which are areas of cattail. And we have blue areas that correspond to sedges, and deep purple areas that correspond to floating leaved plant communities, things that live in deep water, and so on and so on. And if you look carefully, you'll see that these communities are isolated into different patches within this wetland. So the question becomes, how do these isolated populations maintain contact, if they do at all? Now, we could certainly do a similar kind of a map for animals. It doesn't have to just be plants, but plants are good in that they tend to be rather mappable, so they're a good one for us to use as an example. So the answer as to how they maintain contact is the issue of dispersal. So for example, cattails produce these structures that we refer to as cattails. Those are actually seed heads, and by late summer these seed heads are fully mature and they start to come apart, and the seeds are carried on the wind or they're carried in water to other locations. So plants like cattails are actually quite good dispersers because they can use phenomena like those in order to get from one place to another. So even though those populations of cattails are isolated, they can still exchange genetic material as seeds from one area blow to another. And we could say much the same about some of these other kinds of plant associations. These plants have got one way or another of getting their seeds from one place to others on this wetland, and also from this spot to other places where populations of these plants occur. So, to summarize, we define metapopulations as sets of geographically isolated populations that occupy patches of suitable habitat. And metapopulations maintain contact with each other by dispersal of individuals in the case of animals, or seeds in the case of plants, from one place to another. So on this image here, we again see an aerial infrared image upon which plant communities have been mapped. And in this case, the green areas refer to a kind of a marsh plant called Scirpus, and the blue areas correspond to a marsh plant called Acorus. So we have these two populations isolated into different patches, and again, just like with the last image, these populations are able to keep in contact by dispersal of seeds. Now we can ask the question, what if these patches of habitat that individuals are dispersing between are not equal? Suppose one of the patches of habitat is like this, highly disturbed, interfered water flow, construction going on around it. So we have this one patch of marshland here which doesn't look like a terribly red-hot place to make a living. And let's compare it to another spot. Suppose instead we have a wetland like this, very extensive, pristine, no disturbance by people. How would those two compare in terms of ability to maintain populations? How might they compare in terms of ability of species within them to disperse to other areas? Well, these are questions that we will be answering in our next program.